This is Rights and Wrongs. This week, the texture of progress for LGBT rights, told by three men who've been working on it for decades.
I'm Kyle Knight. I have been a researcher in the LGBT rights program at Human Rights Watch for 11 years.
I'm Dédé Oetomo. I'm a queer activist in Surabaya, Indonesia.
My name is Philip Ayub, and I am a political scientist.
Over the past 20 years, the rights of LGBT folks have expanded in a ton of ways all over the world.
20 years ago, the world was a very different place for LGBT rights. 20 years ago, we only had a couple countries who legally recognized same-sex couples, and now we have dozens. 20 years ago, we had over 90 countries that considered adult consensual same-sex conduct a crime, and we're now down to 62 or so. 20 years ago, there were 0 countries in the world that allowed transgender people to change their legal gender, and we now have 20. So it was a very, very different environment.
It's also true that it is 2025.
A constitutional amendment passed in the Hungarian parliament on Monday codifies a ban on LGBTQ events.
To make sure that homosexuals have no space in Uganda.
The Trump administration can force people to ID themselves on passports based on their sex at birth, meaning male or female.
Burkina Faso's ruling military junta has passed a law criminalizing homosexuality and making it punishable with up to 5 years in prison.
Russia's top court has ruled that LGBTQ activists should be designated as extremists.
Against new laws that ban sex outside of marriage for citizens and foreigners alike.
That last clip refers to Indonesia, where in January 2026, a new criminal code provision goes into effect, criminalizing any sexual relations outside of a husband and a wife. You're listening to Rights and Wrongs by Human Rights Watch. My name is Gofen Putubuele. I'm a radio producer and a lawyer. Human Rights Watch asked me to look at the human rights hotspots around the world through the eyes and ears of people on the front lines of history. Kyle, United States. I'm going to assume you were doing something sort of LGBTQ human rights-esque pre-Human Rights Watch in 2015. Is that right?
I actually wasn't. I was working as a journalist. Well, and I guess you could say I kind of was, but I felt like I was fighting upstream. So as a mainstream reporter, as a bureau chief, as someone writing for sort of general outlets, I remember taking LGBT stories, including really egregious one, trans people being murdered or something like this, and having my editors say, well, it's okay. It's not really a headline, right? It's not really a big deal. And sort of fighting that fight inside news companies to try to get people to take these issues seriously. And then in addition to that, I started out when I first moved to New York City, I volunteered for a suicide prevention hotline targeted to LGBTQ youth. And I think through that, being trained and spending those hours in a cubicle picking up a phone for strangers who were in crisis, I started understanding that the texture of progress was a little bit different than even what headlines that I wanted to write as a journalist would tell. For example, I remember one night, all of a sudden, the phone started ringing like crazy. We're sitting in New York City and the phone started going off the hook. And we were like, what happened? All that we could tell from the phone numbers that everyone was calling from Iowa out in the Midwest. And it was a very bizarre thing. We would get a trickle of calls from different states, but certainly not 50 calls in a night from Iowa. What had happened was the Iowa Supreme Court, now this is before the U.S. Supreme Court, but the Iowa State Supreme Court had legalized same-sex marriage. And all of a sudden, all of these gay kids were panicked because all of a sudden the homophobia of their parents came out. I had one kid who called and started saying, look, I thought everything was going to be okay. I thought my parents were like kind of live and let live, kind of cool. And then when we were watching the nightly news and they announced the Supreme Court had legalized same-sex marriage, my father crumpled up his beer can and threw it at the TV and cursed. And I was like, I have to get out of my own house, right? So it was this sort of glimpse at the other side of progress, that a really momentous thing that happens in one part of the world for queer or trans people is not necessarily going to make everyone's lives better. It could actually make things pretty bad on the other side of the world really, really quickly. And I think we saw that manifest, including in the case of Indonesia.
Dédé, Indonesia, mid-1970s. When did you come out to yourself?
To myself, but still thinking that I could change. I came out in 1974. I was 20.
Okay. Dédé Oetomo is a queer activist in Surabaya, Indonesia.
I got tired of all the depression and everything, crushes on the wrong guys.
Yeah.
So I decided to try to help myself. Went to see a shrink, a psychologist. Thankfully, no electrodes or anything. But then this was the 70s. The psychologist sent me to an internist for anatomical inspection. And so the internist says that I have to have a hormone examination. And that could only be done in Jakarta, in the capital. And my saving was not enough to go to Jakarta. So I had to tell my parents, look, I'm in trouble. I actually did not really tell them, but I faked a letter from the psychologist and slipped it in the evening paper.
Okay.
As I was giving it to my dad. And so I waited in the living room and they came out. And I said, okay, we'll go to Jakarta and find out what we need to do. So that was how it came out to my parents.
Wait. How did they react when they came out and they're like, okay, I guess we're going to Jakarta?
I think my mother must have shed one tear, and then, but they're practical people. Okay, you and your dad go to Jakarta.
Okay.
And so we did go to Jakarta, and this is where my dad should have told me right away. My dad was told by the professor, Mr. Oetomo, there's nothing you can do about your son. He just has to adapt to society.
Okay.
But he didn't tell me that.
Which means you started when? 2015?
I started, in January of 2015.
What was the world's temperature on LGBTQ issues in 2015?
Wow. I think we were starting to see you could actually get governments to come together and agree to a statement that said, we believe that violence and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity needs to stop. But I think in 2015, we also saw some major events that triggered backlash. The biggest one, of course, was when the Supreme Court in the US legalized same-sex marriage in June of that year. The first project I worked on when I got hired at Human Rights Watch in 2015 is about 3 weeks into my time here. I got a notice from one of my colleagues who covered Central Asia saying that the parliament in Kazakhstan was considering a quote-unquote gay propaganda bill. And so in the context of this, remember, this is early 2015. We are barely 2 years out from Vladimir Putin passing his gay propaganda bill in Russia, which sailed through parliament. It was like one of the most popular bills ever. And basically the law says that if you're going to talk about gay people in public, it has to be negative, right? You can't say anything positive or neutral about gay people or you're committing propaganda and you can be fined and put on trial and stuff like that. And so this was, getting copycatted throughout the sphere of influence of Russia. And so off I went to Kazakhstan. And it was a really brutal couple weeks of interviewing people. All the usual things were happening: violence, discrimination, attacks, extortion. Everyone wanted to leave. They would do anything to get a visa to go to another country and just get out. So this hellscape that they were living in. But there was one interview that stuck with me in particular, and it was the very last one I did on the trip.
It was actually like a reading course.
Dédé, Indonesia, mid-1970s. Dédé returns from the hormone exam in Jakarta, and in Surabaya, his hometown, his psychologist says they should meet regularly, like every 2 weeks.
He gave me these books on sexuality, sex research, this and that. Let's compare our readings. And so I actually exchanged books and stuff. And said, do you have a girlfriend? I said, well, try to have one. But I also looked for books myself. And from my reading, one Time magazine issue, the 1976 the Matlovich issue.
On March 6, Sergeant Leonard Matlovich disclosed to a supervising officer at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia that he was a homosexual and wanted to stay in the Air Force.
And one book on homosexual behavior among males. And those two actually convinced me that there's nothing wrong with me, but I was not brave enough to tell my parents, but I stopped seeing the psychologist.
But there was one interview that stuck with me in particular, and it was the very last one I did on the trip. My flight was leaving that night, and there was this woman who had agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Almaty. And we went and we sat with her, and I was working with an interpreter because I don't speak Russian and she doesn't speak English. And it was a total upper, which doesn't happen in this line of work a lot. It was such a cool interview because all she did was describe how she had figured out how to make a life for herself that was safe and was awesome, and she was thriving. And so she was 24 years old. Her partner was 24 years old, and they had a kid together. They had a 4-year-old daughter. She worked at a marketing firm. I think her girlfriend was like a lawyer or something, but they had figured out how to make this really solid urban middle class life for themselves. They lied to their landlord and said that they were sisters, and that's how they got the apartment. They lied to the daycare and said that they were cousins, and that's how they could both pick up the kid from school. And they just figured out how to make everything kind of function. And I was like, God, this is so nice to hear after 2 weeks of listening to stories that I expect about torture, but it's just it was so great. And at the end, I said to her what I say to everyone at the end of these interviews is I said, do you have any questions for me? And, I typically get asked, do you have a boyfriend, or how tall are you, or whatever. I typically get silly questions. And she said, no, actually, I have a question for you. And I said, okay. She said, you're American, right? I said, yeah. I said, but you do understand that I'm not here representing the United States. She said, yeah, I get that. And she said, I have a question about American science. And I said, okay.
In 1978, I went to Cornell to study.
Cornell has a Center for Indonesian Studies. Dédé went to teach Indonesian.
And I think the first week I already saw flyers from the gay organization on campus. But it took me a year and a half before I actually made a call to the organization. But in the meantime, again, I read more. Finally, on Christmas Eve, I think it was 1979, I came out to my best friend from Indonesia, who was also studying at Cornell. So, but then, that winter intercession, I came out to just about everyone. In a letter, directly. One of the things that I used to do to kind of encourage myself is to put up posters for, gay dances or things like that. And so, a friend or professor would be walking by and said, oh, yes. So, it was, so I came out more or less the American way. And actually, I even shocked one particular Indonesian studies professor, the late Ben Anderson. He was actually, what is this Indonesian doing? This is so un-Indonesian.
And she said, when I go online and look up same-sex parenting, I keep coming across this study from the U.S. that says that the children raised by same-sex parents are ruined by this. And we're considering giving our daughter up to an orphanage because we don't want to ruin her life. And I was stunned. I was like, and the interpreter I was working with, who was an LGBT activist, was also kind of taken aback by this. But I very quickly knew what she was talking about. And what she was talking about was this study that had been published in the early 2000s by a sociologist at the University of Texas named Mark Regnerus, where he had followed a cohort of kids raised by same-sex parents and had found worse mental health outcomes, kids dropping out of school, drug use, all kinds of stuff like that. And he had published it. And this study had been used very successfully to challenge same-sex marriage progress in the U.S., including in the state courts and stuff like that. And then a little bit later, some other sociologists got a hand on his data, ran it again, and it was nonsense. He had to retract it. The journal issued an apology. The university had to formally censure him. And that was a huge tipping point, right? Mind you, we are sitting in Kazakhstan months before the U.S. Supreme Court legalizes same-sex marriage. And the fact that the Regnerus study had been essentially nullified a few years prior was the jet fuel that led us to this point in the U.S. Mm-hmm. But in the Russian-speaking world, it still existed as the truth because the right-wing religious groups that translated the study into Russian and other languages and pumped it out into the world to see, look, American science says same-sex couples should not raise kids. It's funny, they didn't go and translate the retraction. And here you had this woman who, for all intents and purposes, was one of the most capable people I've ever met and had fully figured out a life to thrive and let her kid thrive. And she was literally thinking of putting her kid in an orphanage on the basis of this fake news that had come out of the US and had not been appropriately corrected in her language space on the internet. And that sat with me because I thought, well, this is why we need to keep making a fuss. This is why it's not over. And it's certainly not over when we achieve something for ourselves in one little corner of the world and don't project it out better. And so a lot of what I carried with me over the following 11 years as I did this work was realizing that the information we put out in the world really matters for that reason. The way we tell these stories really matter. The fact that we put it out in different languages, the fact that we take a lot of attention to putting it on different formats, getting it into different forms of media, because she was one Google search away from making this enormous decision. And the fact that we could sit with her and explain through this interpreter that, like, actually there was a retraction, actually that study is not true, I mean, completely changed how she was going to live her life. And that was just one person. You can imagine this at scale.
First, it was like an argument. Come on, you're from Southeast Asia. Why do you need this gay liberation? But finally, he actually provided me with readings about traditional cultural forms of queer and trans people.
Can you tell me about the 5-gender expression?
This is amongst the Bugis, which is one of the hundreds of tribes in Indonesia. They have words for 4 genders: men, women, women who become men, and men who become women. And then if you, for some reason, get some kind of revelation from the deities, then you have to have all 4 gender expressions on you to communicate with the gods or goddesses. I grew up with folk theater where women's parts are played by men. And I read about institutionalized pedophilia in a district in my province, west of Surabaya. It's all very ritualized. It's a search of prowess. The man looking for searching for prowess has to give, maybe 2 water buffaloes to the parents of the boy. And in the old days, it was a prestigious position to be taken by a powerful man. If you look at it from now, it's pedophilia. It's a no-no. From historical text, I learned that one of our greatest kings in the 14th century used to like dancing as a drag queen in front of his minister. And this is mentioned in the court annals. So it's very powerful.
Tell me why it's powerful.
Because the powers that be, the ruling powers, they always say, oh, we should maintain our culture, the culture of our ancestors. So, people like me would say, look, here's the culture of our ancestors. I'm not the only one. People in Southeast Asia, I'm sure also other places, have actually said, what we get from the West is the homophobia and the transphobia.
I think as I started doing this research and I started going to other parts of the world, and where my job was literally to sit with queer and trans people and listen to them and ask them questions and understand the texture of their lives, I started understanding also why it was so important that in places like the US, it was important to keep making a fuss.
When we come back, Dédé returns to Indonesia in the mid-1980s. He starts to live his queer life, and stuff starts to change across the world.
Hi, my name is Tanya Lokshina, and I'm an associate director in the Europe and Central Asia division at Human Rights Watch. I used to run our office in Moscow, but after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the government shut us down, and all of the Moscow-based staff had to flee or face criminal prosecution. Our team is now spread far and wide. But does this mean that we actually stopped working? Absolutely not. We are working harder than ever before to document and expose the abuses by the Russian government at home and abroad. We do our utmost to support local partners. We have a network of sources on the ground. We continue to interview survivors of abuses, and we are doing open source investigations and digital data analysis. We do this to create a meticulous record of violations so that eventually the perpetrators can be brought to justice. We cannot do this work without your support. Please visit hrw.org/podcast/donate. Thank you.
It is the early 1980s, and Dédé is still at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York.
After the weekly discussion at Gay People at Cornell, a bunch of us went to Common Ground, the only gay disco in Ithaca. It became my hangout in Ithaca for the next 3.5 years.
And can you just describe to me like what a night at Common Ground was like? Like you walk in, or people are dancing, people are chatting
And drinking, and I would sometimes run into Professor so and so. It's like, oh, okay.
Do you remember any of the music at all?
Oh, Donna Summer, Michael Jackson, We Are Family. Who is that by?
Yeah.
We Are Family.
Yeah, Sister Sledge.
Sister Sledge, yes. I remember once I actually had my birthday party there, so I invited everyone. There are about 40 of us in the bar.
You're in your 20s at this point?
Yes, I came out when I was 26.
So, Indonesia really had this sort of long period of live and let live, right, in terms of LGBT people. And this is where Dédé came up as an activist. It really was pretty chill.
1984, I came back to Indonesia.
When you come back to Indonesia in like 5 years after Cornell, like basically on a range of like, I'm going to live my open gay life to, oh no, if I say I'm gay, I will die. Where are you on that spectrum?
Very out.
Okay.
Because those days it was acceptable for two men and two women to be, intimate with each other in public. You were just seen as brothers or friends. And it's what Western people usually say about, the Middle East and actually in Southeast Asia. Now, if anything, people are kind of reluctant to do that because, then they're going to think we're gay or we're lesbian or things like that. Yeah. But those days it was very free.
It really was pretty chill. But it was there on this like informal social contract that if you guys don't poke your heads up above the radar too much, we're not going to beat you down. Also because pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, we've never criminalized this population. So we've never had that big cudgel that like so much of the world did.
Dédé and his friends start a gay magazine in the Indonesian language.
And I was saying to myself that we will publish a magazine every 2 months or so because the mainstream media does not publish much that is neutral or positive about homosexuality and gender diversity and all that. So that's the idea. So some translations, some original essays, and I learned from personal ads in the U.S. that, people did write. And, I would like to have my ad in this. And we were kind of the precursors of Grindr and Hornet and all that. And then by the second issue, people already was contributing articles about, one article was actually the prospect of a marriage equality that earlier. In some places we had bars, like in Jakarta, and in Surabaya, I think it was every Thursday night or something, there would be a gay night at one bar. And so we were okay. And I think it must have been 1990 or 1991. We were interviewed by national TV. And so there are some kids who were, saying, "Oh, yeah, faggots," but we ignored them. But all our neighbors knew about it. We were called a legend couple.
What does that mean?
Because we were the first couple to show on TV and did not show any negative feelings. And there were no attacks yet at that time, early 90s. I was 36.
Okay, so then what changes?
People dated differently, but I would date it in the late 90s. In 1997, for the first time, young Muslim men harassed people in the town square of Yogyakarta. That was the first time we heard about it. Now, okay, if you're trans, you can be harassed also. Yeah, so this is about gay men. And then that was 1997. In 1998, we got rid of the dictator. We thought we got rid of him. So we were naive. In 1999, we thought it was a small meeting, but with a pompous name, a national working meeting. Well, basically 20 organizations meeting in the town of Solo, kind of 1 hour from Yogyakarta.
A working meeting on
queer issues. And we were naive, so we sent press releases to the media, and the local Islamic vigilante was looking for me. That day, we have to burn him, We thought, now that we have more democracy, we could do this. And, we were wrong. I had to hide in a hotel. The hotel where we were about to have the national conference kindly actually moved everyone to another hotel, and I didn't tell the vigilantes. And myself, they said, well, you should go to a more secluded hotel. So I went to a hotel that is connected to the local palace. So that was.
Were you scared? You seemed like you were not worried at all.
No, I mean, this is me. I'm like that. My partner was. He was actually swearing at me. Don't take those calls from the press. So as I was hiding in that hotel, I was taking calls from the media because I knew I was safe.
Okay. But there's just also like a local vigilante who's like, we should burn Dédé.
Yes.
I mean, how did things like increase from there? So that's the late 90s.
Yes.
And you see, basically you're describing sort of like, okay, initially, first thing that you see as a difference is like people are kind of threatening the like hangout that you have.
Yeah.
And then it's like this conference that you want to do.
Yes. After 2000, I'm actually jumping to 2015, which if you remember the Human Rights Watch manuscript that Kyle Andreas maybe worked on, that's when everyone, ministers, members of parliament, clerics, they started saying bad things about homosexuality and gender diversity.
When the anti-LGBT moral panic of 2016 began, it was almost exactly 6 months after the U.S. legalized same-sex marriage, and the same-sex marriage conversations were pumping up in Australia too. And it is related in the sense that politicians started exploiting that moment to say, like, we need to differentiate ourselves from these white countries that are doing this gay stuff, right? As you saw this, and it unfolded very, very quickly. It started with one tweet from the Minister of Education saying, I'm not really sure we should have LGBT student groups on campuses. And within like 3 weeks, it was like a total race to the bottom. And the rhetoric unfolded, everything ranging from the absurd to the apocalyptic, right? So you had the mayor of Bandung, which is one of the bigger cities outside of Jakarta, at a seminar for pregnant women, expectant mothers, just randomly started giving a speech about don't feed your kids instant noodles or they'll turn gay. And then a few days later, the Minister of Defense, who controls the Indonesian military, he said the LGBT movement was worse than dropping a nuclear weapon on Jakarta. And so at that level, you started seeing it unfold in this like just really big ways. And of course the tabloids can jump on it. This stuff is ripe for tabloids. And they would start door-stopping politicians and they would say, what crazy thing can you say about LGBT people today? And it just became this like rhetorical race. Then you had people kind of at the next level in the sort of technocrat version who were like, cool, let's jump on this and make policy, right? So the National Child Protection Commission did their own version of a gay propaganda policy about TV. They started to regulate how effeminate men could be on TV, or like whatever. They just come whatever was in their purview, they did it, right, to show that they were on a certain side of this. And then at the next level down, you had people's actual lives, right? You had police raids. You had people getting targeted and handed in by their neighbors.
So this is my take. Using communism as a scare tactic is not effective anymore. And so they need a new political football, and that's LGBT. You want to get your conservative voters to vote for you, make sure you are against these immoral people. You want a promotion at the police? Make sure you raid some gay party and hotel.
One story stands out to me when I was there, right when this crisis began, when I flew out. I was in one of the sort of northern islands, and I was speaking with this trans woman who was probably in her late 60s, early 70s, and had transitioned as a teenager, and now owned the shop that her father had run, a little convenience store by the side of the road, and I never really had a problem. She lived in the same neighborhood, and everyone was cool and bought their cigarettes from her, and like that was just kind of her life until now, right? And she said to her, the scariest thing was in the mornings when kids were walking or riding their bikes to school in their uniforms, they would typically go by and greet her. And now they would go by and point and yell LGBT, LGBT, LGBT as they went by her shop. And she was like, they don't even know what that means, right? They just know that they're supposed to hate me all of a sudden, right? And she's like, all of a sudden, this sort of social contract that kept me safe, that kept my business viable, that kept my life what it was, is gone, right? And even like the 8-year-olds get to ruin that for me. And it was a complete shock to her system because this was the fabric of her life. This is what held it together.
The limited chance that I have in talking to younger people, some of them are truly afraid. In Indonesia these days, 2025, no national level politicians are going to defend us.
That brings us to the sound of now.
Les LGBT sont un lobby, un micro-lobby.
Politicians around the world describing the LGBTQ as a lobby. A lobby that undermines presidents.
Des gens qui essayent d'influencer la politique nationale au détriment de la majorité, qui veulent imposer.
A lobby that tries to influence national politics and impose its own vision of the world on the majority to its detriment.
Leo Hare and his family described themselves as moral migrants, Americans who relocated to Russia in search of salvation.
We were noticing a great upsurge in LGBT type policies coming into the government, especially the school system.
There's no risk of that in Russia, where so-called LGBT propaganda is banned.
This is a complete demonic attack against the conservative Christian families, and we will not stand for this.
These sorts of quotes don't sound the same by accident. Philip Ayub, England. This is maybe like my most fundamental basic question is like, why does rallying around like LGBTQ and queer, that group of people, why does that work as a tool to like rally people in a country? Because if you look around the world, you see, okay, this is a common thing in many places across cultures. Why does that work as a tool?
That's a great question, and it is a fundamental one. There's different ways to answer it, but there's something about gender and sexuality because they are fluid concepts. They ask people to think about the world in a slightly different way. There's some fluidity in the concepts that are very easy to present as destabilizing to more fixed or determined identities, like national identity or religious traditional identities can be presented as very fixed. Often they're rooted in a kind of imagined past where everything was much simpler and where there was quote unquote common sense or things were just worked in a quote unquote natural way. And gendered sexuality, because they get at a really real fluidity in life, they're easy to kind of cast as a threat. Maybe we have to think about fluidity in terms of how we think about relationships being structured and how families might look, the kind of intimate relationships that we see as acceptable normatively in a society. That pushes against more fixed or determined categories that states often build an identity around. So national identity, for example, is like, okay, we've always had a people that are unified by this language and this culture and history and ways of doing things. And so oftentimes the nation has excluded queer people because there's this idea of sexual citizenship, the way citizens should look and behave. And that's also predicated on the idea of a family that reproduces, etc. This, cis and heterosexual family. Religion also, that's also kind of a more fixed identity. While there's a lot of different religious interpretations, etc., often when it comes to talking about religion vis-a-vis claims around gendered sexuality, it's presented as very simple and very incompatible, in that religion has always thought of what's right and wrong in this way, and usually LGBT people will fall into that wrong category. And so the fluidity that comes with LGBT claims are often presented as potentially undoing everything.
Philip actually explains that there is now, mimicking the LGBTQ movement, transnational advocacy conferences around the world where people and politicians from Hungary's Viktor Orban to Italy's Giorgia Meloni to American activists who are behind the efforts to undermine American marriage equality, these folks rally to generate similar language and tactics to oppose the rights of LGBTQ people, often bundling it in terms of gender ideology, generating an anti-rainbow flag, a heterosexual pride flag, a natural families flag.
But you know something? Here's the silver lining. Human rights defenders, they completely understand us compared to 20 years ago.
And you mean Indonesian or just international?
Indonesian. Mm-hmm. And what's good also, the younger, Gen Z activists, they don't mince words when say, that is undemocratic. Are you part of the erosion of democracy? Things like that. Yeah. So I'm actually proud of these kids. Well, I call them kids.
Yeah.
One thing that is also tragic but also special about LGBT people navigating the world is that it's a community that has been in crisis very often. It's a group that has navigated, or a set of groups and identities that have navigated really, really challenging times. And there have been many other periods where folks have asked for rights. So we can think about like the momentous changes in like the 1920s that were happening in some countries, like in Germany, that were then, of course, fully snuffed out by the rise of National Socialism that crushed these movements in a very, very violent way. We could see coming out of the Second World War where LGBT people also tried to be parts of conversations around the UN Charter on Human Rights. For example, there's a Danish group called Circle of 1948, which kind of alludes to that. And so there's been many times where we thought about rights claims and different ways of going at it that have been more or less successful. And so this is not the first rodeo.
Dédé, Philip, Kyle, each are queers working through, living through this moment in queer history. I leave us with a closing thought from Kyle, talking again about his time working in Indonesia.
These socially sedate situations like Indonesia was, this idea that things are okay in a live and let live situation, it seems really nice and it seems to work, but then it can fall apart really, really quickly. And so as much as the way people were able to be safe historically there was by not pushing too hard, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure to support them when people came for them. And it really shifted for me as I was putting all of this together and figuring out how to tell the story, from a public policy advocacy perspective. I started thinking of the law and policy changes that we're pushing for on LGBT rights, whether it be in Indonesia or other contexts. I think of them as infrastructure, similar to the way we think about infrastructure protecting against natural disasters. So we know that, for example, if an earthquake hits, that a city where the earthquake hits, if they have good building codes that are enforced and the buildings are built well, fewer people are going to die because the buildings are not just going to collapse, right? Because they've been built appropriately and these things are enforced. That's kind of how I would see non-discrimination protections. You can imagine some random public officials in Indonesia tweeting that they don't like LGBT people. But then if there's a non-discrimination law that, among many other things, says don't discriminate against LGBT people, it's a very, very different attack when that is standing there. It's a very, very different political moment because there's something that they're going to run up against where the national law says, no, this is part of us. This is part of what we do. These people have the same rights as, women or people with disabilities or, religious minorities or whatever. And so in a sense, like the Indonesian crisis opened my eyes to thinking of the law and policy outcomes that we seek, not as sort of symbolic victories or like individual little bits of rights that we get, but sort of as building this infrastructure around a population that, might not need it all the time, right? Might be able to live and let live and enjoy and thrive and might not even engage and might not want to be activists, and that's perfectly fine. But when you ask, like, what's the fuss? To me, that's what it's about. It's about the building codes, right? It's like, it's annoying. And like, you have to pay a little bit more to get a company to certify that it's built correctly. And there's more inspections and whatever. Yeah, you got to push for legislation and you got to add some more language. And it's just a small group of people essentially and whatever. And you can see politicians grumbling about it. And like, why are you making such a big fuss out of it when you're not like a huge percent of the population or whatever people use as their excuses for not doing it. But to me, when this stuff is necessary is when things go sour because you want that safety net. You want to know that the system is built to respond to this. And I think what the Indonesia crisis showed us is that it was not, because it fell apart so quickly to the point where, elementary school children and what they were seeing on the news at night on TV was fundamentally shifting their opinion of a neighbor who sold them candy. I think there were some glimpses of success. The Constitutional Court threw out a proposal to criminalize. The NGOs were able to rally when they did have public marches. Everyone showed up, the indigenous groups, the women's groups. It wasn't just LGBT people out on their own. But come January, for the first time ever, adult consensual same-sex conduct is a crime in Indonesia. And that's a tectonic shift in a country of that size and with that history.
Kyle is speaking about that new provision of law in the Indonesian Criminal Code that goes into effect of January 2026. Any sex outside of sex between a husband and a wife will be considered illegal. And the law includes a reporting provision, meaning that for it to apply, you must be reported by a parent, partner, or an adult child. You've been listening to Rights and Wrongs from Human Rights Watch. The archival clips in this episode came from France 24, NPR, NBC, Africa News, Reuters, ABC, and CBS. This episode was produced by me and Curtis Fox. Sophie Soloway is the associate producer. Anthony Gale is the executive producer. I'm Gofen Pujubwale. We're taking a few weeks off, but we'll be back early next year with new episodes. Thanks for listening.